Hello and welcome. It's our great pleasure today to have a panel on all the ups and downs and roundabouts of press barony. We're going to be discussing who owns our media and why they own it, really. It's my great pleasure to introduce the man who owned one of our great newspapers, The Telegraph, along with The Spectator, and papers from the Chicago Sun-Times to the Jerusalem Post and many more. Conrad Black is also a historian, biographer of presidents, and political commentator. With him is, on the far left, Simon Jenkins, journalist, former chair of the National Trust, prolific author, most recently of, we don't seem to have it here, but it will be available in the bookshop, fantastic new book called Europe's 100 Best Cathedrals, perfect Christmas present material, and a while back, a book called Newspaper Proprietors, the Market of Glory. For our purposes today, he was also political editor of The Economist, editor of the Evening Standard under the Aitken family, and editor of The Times under Rupert Murdoch. John Preston, journalist and author of The Dig, his novel about the Sutton Hoo excavation, adapted with great success by Netflix into a movie starring Ray Fiennes, Kerry Mulligan, and Lily James. He also wrote A Very English Scandal, his account of the Jeremy Thorpe affair, which was also made into a TV series starring Hugh Grant and Ben Whishaw. And most recently, he has written his, also available in the bookshop, and a perfect Christmas present, his stunning account of the life of Robert Maxwell, Fall, which has been shortlisted for the prestigious Baillie Gifford Prize. So we have, with our wonderful panel, we have a man who has owned newspapers, a man who has written in depth about one particularly colourful man who's owned newspapers, and a man who has assessed the entire breed and edited for several of them. So I thought we would start with the obvious question: why does anyone, or more precisely, perhaps, why did anyone want to own a newspaper? Conrad, can we start with you?
Yes. Well, when I started in this business with my friend Peter White, who's here today, it was a little more than 50 years ago. And it was a very good business. Just as a commerce, it was a good business, and it was a very interesting business because by its nature, it is the news, it is what's happening. And so it is important developments and personalities in every field. So it had the ingredients. And in addition, I will admit, just to kick the ball off here about proprietors, that I was very curious, not particularly motivated to emulate, but curious about and interested in the rather exotic way some of the major newspaper proprietors lived. I remember as a very young person seeing right after the death of William Randolph Hearst a tour of his house at San Simeon, California, the greatest house in the New World. And I didn't aspire exactly to that, but you could see the appeal of that kind of life. So it was a good business, an interesting business, and there were a lot of interesting people in it.
Yeah, sure. And it gives you, a seat in the Lords, a seat at the top table, more precisely, kind of access all areas, sort of. Do you ever think that, did you have an agenda when you went into it? A political agenda?
You mean beyond what I've just said?
Beyond Simeon, San Simeon?
No, but as our company became more prosperous, then we could afford an agenda. I mean, we started out buying, Peter and another person and I, a newspaper in about 7,000 circulation daily newspaper, about 60 miles east of Montreal, and it was losing money. So we had to make it profitable. And we didn't have time for agendas at that point. But the company grew, and as you were kind enough to mention, it grew enormously from where it started. And as we had the means to have agendas, yes, I had some, but they were reasonable and responsible advocacy on public policy issues, not sinister, manipulative designs to corrupt or intimidate politicians or anything like that.
Okay, John, can I ask you? You've been living with Robert Maxwell now for several years, or rather his ghost. What can I ask you the same question? What was in it for him? Why do you think he wanted?
Well, what Maxwell really wanted more than anything else was power and influence. And he had, this was typical of Maxwell, he announced that he wanted to be Prime Minister before he was actually had a constituency, before he became an MP. And he thought that he was going to be greeted with a sort of fanfare of herald trumpeters when he walked into the House of Commons. And that didn't really happen, and all that actually did happen, the only position of responsibility he was ever given was put in charge of the House of Commons Catering Committee. And really as the next best thing, realising he was never going to be Prime Minister or anything anywhere near it, he went into newspapers. Because, you know, when...
Oh, that's interesting. It was the second best to politics.
I think it was, but on the other hand, I mean, you have to remember that when Maxwell finally succeeded in buying a newspaper in 1984, when he bought the Daily Mirror, he and Rupert Murdoch were the two biggest political power brokers in British life. And, you know, the Tories knew that they couldn't be re-elected without the support of the Sun, and the same thing was true with the Labour Party in the Mirror. In terms of whether Maxwell had an agenda, I don't think he had a political agenda. What he really loved about newspapers, it gave him an opportunity to plaster his photograph all over them, which he probably loved more than anything else.
The day he died, the Mirror's circulation, with the Record in Scotland combined, was equal to the Sun's. I mean, whatever may be said of Bob, and lots of things can be, he was actually quite a competent publisher in a way.
Yes, absolutely.
Simon, we could do Aikins, Murdoch, or the breed in general. I mean, you've written a whole book about it. I think from the Hurst Castle anecdote and the idea of, you know, power, we know it's more than a business, newspapers, isn't it? What's your analysis of?
What fascinated me was that it was literally more than a business. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, this was the quickest way you could buy immense influence and power. I mean, you demanded a viscountcy for yourself and your entire family. It came home most vividly to me when I was driving across London with the then new proprietor of the then Evening Standard, a man called Victor Matthews, who was a builder. And Victor Matthews was a lovable but utterly naive man. And he asked the driver to drive the car down Whitehall. And I said, we're trying to get to Fleet Street. And he said, I want to drive down Whitehall, past Downing Street. And he turned to me and he said, how soon? And he wanted an invitation to dinner. And he wanted, more than anything else, an invitation to dinner in Downing Street. And he'd spent millions of pounds on that dinner invitation. And one day he got it and a seat in the House of Lords for doing nothing, for buying a newspaper. And I think what always interested me was that most people, particularly on the left, assume that it's about capitalism.
Yeah.
It's not. It's about personal vanity and glory. And I have to say that the only two people I came across who genuinely loved newspapers, one was Rupert Murdoch, who was an obsessive newspaper man. I mean, he wanted to be there on the back bench and on the stone, as we called it, every night, if he possibly could. And the other, I may say, was Conrad, who really cared about newspapers. Now, this doesn't affect the question of improper influence, all those sort of things, but caring about newspapers was something relatively rare in newspaper proprietors.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, please.
Just a footnote to your reference to Victor Matthews, who was a very nice man, and I had some dealings with him shortly after I became a shareholder in the Telegraph, and he had a rather domineering wife, as you may know. However, the wife was herself intimidated by the family parrot. So when you phoned Victor would, he'd be speaking very politely, and then his wife, whose name I forget right now, I'll remember it in a minute, would say, don't put up with it, Victor, or something like that, you see, and encouraging him to take a tough line. And then the parrot would start, say, sack the lot, sack the lot.
That explains something. One day I was summoned to see him. And he said, why can't we bomb Russia? And I said, well, there are one or two problems involved in that. I'm not quite sure the Evening Standard is strong enough to put the missiles up. But he said, but they're awful people, and we could just wipe them out. And I thought to myself, where did you get this idea from? The parrot.
Parrot. Shayla Parrot is now absolutely the thing.
if I could say one other thing. Yeah. One exception to what we've all said was my countryman, Lord Thomson, the first Lord Thomson, Roy Thomson. He loved newspapers as a business. He didn't give a damn about the contents. But, the famous interview where they said, well, why do you want to buy more newspapers, Lord Thomson? He said, well, to make more money. Well, why do you want to make more money? To buy more newspapers. And I thought he, as far as I knew, he was, as he deserved, he was a very nice man. He was very popular in this country, and I thought it was partly because he was a nice man, but also because it fulfilled, if I may say it, the British caricature of the American and Canadian businessman. He had no affectation to being interested in anything except money, and which is sort of a widespread British view of North Americans, to excess at times.
Question for everybody that it just always occurs to one when you think about newspapers: why so many Canadians?
You mean in Britain?
Well, and in Britain, but particularly in British newspaper ownership. I'm just thinking you work for the Aiken family. Is it paper? Is it
the Commonwealth? It was Australia as well. I mean,
yes,
and Australia. Okay.
At least two. The answer is they spoke English.
Right.
Well, it comes from the days when people were more imperially minded, and so a Canadian or Australian might aspire to go to London in a way that wouldn't necessarily be the case now.
Okay, so it's an extra dose of sort of
Rupert Murdoch went to Oxford, and then he just sort of stayed,
Yeah.
Roy Thomson, if he were alive now, would be, 120 or something. And that was, Canada was a dominion in those days. It wasn't really an independent country. Yeah. So, he was just moving up, He went to Toronto and then to London.
But there's a sort of social solidity there, isn't there, that we find in sort of, in Maxwell's story most particularly, I suppose there's a sort of...
Well, social solidity, I wouldn't put too much freight on that wagon. He was a strange cat.
Yeah.
But I want to ask Conrad that, when you bought the Telegraph, what did that actually buy you in terms of power and influence?
Well, it was a little like what I said about our first newspaper. It was trading insolvent, so I didn't have too much time to, drive around Downing Street and, hold out a sign saying, Mrs. Thatcher, please phone me. But they, I was in the newspaper business in a very modest way in another country. Although we got up to, we had the Le Soleil in Quebec, a newspaper that was well known in French Canada, and it was a natural thing to aspire to one of the greatest newspapers in Europe. And it still had then, and retained all the time we had it, a circulation of over 1 million. It was the largest broadsheet newspaper in outside the United States and Japan, and only narrowly exceeded in the U.S. And so we reckoned that we could fix it up quick. You see, I don't want to filibuster you, but this was at a time when everyone was wondering what Rupert Murdoch was going to do with his new plant at Wapping near the Tower of London, which was unoccupied except by security and cleaning staff. And I knew him a little bit from New York, and I phoned him and asked him what he was going to do. And he said, well, I can't tell you, but I'm going to take drastic measures. Well, I knew him well enough to have great confidence in what that amounted to. And so I thought it was a good bet for us to invest in the Telegraph, because that terrible labor climate where the shop stewards could just shut the paper down on a whim and there's nothing you could do about it, that era was going to end. It was well known that the Thatcher government wished the climate of labor relations in the United Kingdom to be
Conrad,
reformed.
Do you mind? I'm very aware that sort of half the people in this room will understand what Wapping was about, and half won't. Simon, could you just give us a little potted history of that sort of period of newspaper history in England?
How long have you got? It was a very important period. I mean, if you take newspapers right up until the post-war period, were basically party instruments. They were invented for, they were used by, and they were in every sense dominated by the party the paper supported. The famous Daily Herald, which is a Labour paper, a trade union paper, the staff would sing every day, "We have no party, creed or bias, we want a peerage for Elias," who was the name of the owner. And that's what it was like. The concept of editorial independence, which is absolutely deep in the modern newspaper, is a relatively new phenomenon. And it really didn't come in until after the Second World War, the idea of the editor being the god. But the thing that really was ruining it was that they were quite profitable, and the profits were going entirely into staffing, into the cost of the publication. It wasn't until Murdoch came along or Eddie Shah was the first man, much forgotten but hero figure. He started a paper called Today in the early 80s, and they said this has simply got to stop. And Murdoch went to Wapping was the great move. Behind a wall, no printers on the premises at all. And it was a great battle. I mean, every night there were drunken riots outside the building. But at the end of it, he won. I may say even Rupert was ready to capitulate. And it was his senior editors.
Oh, really?
It really was Charlie Wilson, Andrew Neil, one or two of those people, who said, we're not going to go back, having gone through the hell we've gone through. And
Bruce Matthews carried water on both shoulders.
Bruce Matthews, and Bert Hardy before him. But I mean, it was a great battle. The result of that was it slashed costs. Now, when I became a journalist, there were 10 morning newspapers in Britain, and there were not 10 morning newspapers in any other city on earth, except possibly Tokyo. Do you know how many there are today? 10. And the reason is Wapping. There cannot be another private sector industry in Britain with that continuity of product, without any regulation, without any interference with government at all. So it was a phenomenal achievement.
Yes.
Now, of course, a different thread's on the horizon, but we'll come on to that later.
Yes, we'll come on to that. Can we talk about, I'm fascinated that he was going to capitulate and there the staff were, and that brings us on to this relationship between the proprietor and the editor, as you said, a sort of new idea of editorial independence. Conrad, what was your relationship with your editors like?
Generally pretty good. It varied because they were quite different personalities. When we took over, we hired Max Hastings for the Daily and Perry Worsthorne for the Sunday. And Max had, I believe, had served with you in liberating the Falkland Islands and was a famous reporter, not an editor, but a famous reporter and a military historian. Many here would know him, a tall, energetic, rather dashing man, but with a number of foibles. And and Perry Worsthorne was sort of a controversialist, and we thought he'd liven the Sunday paper up. And I would say they both were very good editors. Now, once we got into the price war launched by Murdoch, Max, like a good many people who are somewhat overbearing, he became a bit unsettled by it, and he retired. I mean, I think he thought I was losing confidence in him. I wasn't as an editor, but there were a few areas that he didn't deal well with. I didn't think the leaders were good, and he hadn't moved to get us good letters. As Paul Johnson said, we had boring little letters from boring little people, and you have to phone up prominent people and ask them to send you a letter. See, but Max wasn't up for things like that. But then anyway, Max demoted himself to the Evening Standard because, as he confessed to me years later, he was afraid I was going to fire him, which I was not going to do. And then we had Charles Moore, who was an outstanding editor. He had been at the Spectator and then at the Sunday Telegraph, and then at the Sunday Telegraph, Perry retired, and Dominic Lawson became the editor, and they were very good. And ultimately, Boris Johnson became the editor of the Spectator. So we had fine editors, very fine editors.
I mean, we're obliged to concentrate on Boris for a minute here. What was your experience? I mean, you chose him you selected him, you oversaw that. What was your experience of being Boris's boss?
Well, I had recommended that he go to Brussels for the Daily Telegraph, and that's where he really, as you all know, became famous. And he wasn't particularly anti-Europe when he arrived in Brussels, but he, for a variety of reasons, did become so, at least anti the European Union. And then we had to make a change, and I thought he'd be very good because he was such a good columnist for us and such a good reporter. And he is, as the whole world knows, a very entertaining man. And just right for the Spectator, I thought. But there were problems with inefficiency, but you could shore up the Spectator editor with a more efficient deputy, and that led to other complications. But, I offered it to Boris, but he had run in the 1997 election, which was a bad year for the Conservatives. And the famous election where on a doorstep a lady said, "You don't have to canvass here, I'm already voting for you." And with the television cameras running, Boris said, "Why?" And I said, "You know, Boris, if you're going to do this, you can't run for Parliament, at least for a while. I mean, you've really got to, you know, get into it before you do that." And she said, "Oh, of course, absolutely." And then 2 weeks later, my sources in the Conservative Party told me that he had put in for selection for 2 constituencies, not one but 2, and, including Michael Heseltine's in Henley, which I believe he still holds, does he not? So I invited him back to see me, and we went through this. And, you know, he did the Boris thing. "Oh, yes, it's terrible." And he kept pulling his hair and virtually urging me to fire him and so on. And I said, "Look, Boris, come on. I mean, look, let's get serious. That's not what I want to do. I think you'll be a good editor, but you've got to actually do the job, and you have to tell the proprietor the truth, for God's sake." I mean, I told our directors, we got a rather august group of directors, and I said what the arrangements were. And I said, "Look, I'm not terribly embarrassed by this, but we just can't run this business this way." So he said, "Yes, absolutely," and saluted about 5 times, and he went. But he was a good editor. He was a bit disorganized, but he was a good editor, and he was a good editor even as an MP. He cited Ian MacLeod as the, you know, as the president, who was editor of the Spectator, well, a very prominent member of the Conservative Party.
Yes. Okay. And that period at the Spectator, have you had any? It did end up as a play called The Sextator. I think we just have to say that. Were you aware of the goings on there while you were owning it?
You mean the peccadillos and things?
Yes. There was a, you know, it was a great sort of.
Look,
flourishing.
I can't resist just giving one tiny vignette of what it was like. The publisher was a very purposeful lady from California named Kimberly Fortier. And the deputy editor, as you would know, was Petronella Wyatt, also a very able person, very nice person. All of them are nice. But because there was an involvement between the editor and the deputy editor, the publisher phoned me and demanded to know if Petronella had been invited to the dinner that we had after each director's meeting. And I said, "Well, I really don't know, but I'll ask Rosemary Miller, who ran my office, to let you know." "Why? I mean, what difference does it make to you?" And she said, "Well, I will not come to dinner with that scarlet woman." So I said, "I mean, Kimberly, for God's sakes, we're not running the Salvation Army here. It's none of our business what goes on in other people's romantic lives." And that was that. And about a week after that, it burst out in the media that she was having a torrid affair with the Home Secretary. David Blunkett, remember the blind man always went around with his dog?
I remember very well.
And so it was a febrile atmosphere around there in more ways than one.
But it does tell us about the close relationship between the media and the politics.
Our position was we did it, unless they did something that was absolutely morally outrageous and an outrage to public decency. It was none of our business as long as they got the paper out.
I begin to wonder what that could have been after that story, but anyway, let's ask as well.
Particularly given that Boris's wife was a talented divorce lawyer.
Simon, you work for more than one proprietor, so who's in charge, really, the editor or the proprietor? How did you manage that relationship? Who's calling the shots, in your experience?
I mean, it's a very intimate relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, you're almost in daily contact. The proprietor is the business. Everybody tends to think the proprietor is, in some sense, in charge, but he or she is not, because it's a daily product. And the editor's in charge. An editor of a newspaper, I think, is one of the most powerful people in the land, because they're daily in charge. It's like a general who's actually at the front line rather than in the headquarters. But everybody's different. I mean, Rupert Murdoch really wasn't very interested in politics. I mean, when Margaret Thatcher resigned or was kicked out, he said, what on earth's gone wrong? So I said, well, I'm afraid she's lost the faith of her party. So he said, well, who's going to take over? So I said, well, all the talk is someone called John Major. Who's he? I mean, it was on that level and he was usually in America. A lot of these people are buzzing left, right, and centre all the time anyway. And it really does largely depend on whether the ship is steady, the circulation is going up. Circulation is an obsession of proprietors, not money, because circulation is glory. Money is just money. Usually they're rich, they don't care too much about the money, provided the glory is coming. That's my whole thesis. And the glory is a very, very complicated thing. Going back to your earlier question about why are these people coming from all sorts of Australia and Canada? I mean, the answer is, and they're coming from where? The Berries came from Wales, they come from Ireland, they come to London because London's it has this magnetic field around the London press. And it's a lot of it's to do with status, almost to do with class. Pucker people very rarely survive with unpuckered proprietors. It's all about this sort of relationship. And I think it's impossible to describe in anything other than specific terms to each particular relationship. I mean, I edited 2 newspapers, both of which were going bankrupt. And that's always a difficult situation for anyone to find themselves in, both proprietor and editor. But it is critical because it's through the editor that the staff have their morale boosted or otherwise. So your job is to constantly keep morale up while usually coping with a sort of gorilla in the back room. Some of them.
Present company accepted. So, John Maxwell, with his editors, he had a very strange relationship with the people who worked for him, didn't he? Will you just tell us a little bit about that?
Maxwell bullied everybody who was beneath him.
He was an equal opportunities employer.
Yes. I mean, I think that Maxwell had this extraordinary obsession with wanting to be the biggest media mogul in the world. And the trouble was, every time he tried to buy a newspaper, Rupert Murdoch would snatch it from underneath his nose. And in fact, we talked about Today, which was the first colour tabloid. And Maxwell typically phoned up Rupert Murdoch to boast that he'd just bought Today. And during the course of the conversation, he let slip that he hadn't actually signed the contract yet. And Murdoch said, "Oh, thank you very much. I'm fascinated to hear it." And the moment Murdoch put the phone down, he got on a flight to London and snatched the paper from underneath Maxwell's nose. And this, as far as Maxwell was concerned, was, I mean, it drove him, literally drove him nuts, I think, in the end. And as far as Murdoch was concerned, Maxwell was this kind of perpetual irritant that he could never quite manage to brush off. But as far as Maxwell was concerned, Murdoch really became his kind of arch nemesis. And in trying to go kind of toe-to-toe with Murdoch, he set in train the chain of events which essentially led to ultimately to his death. And in terms of how did Maxwell deal with his editors, he dealt with them in exactly the same way as everybody else, which is he just, told them what to do. And by and large, they did it. But he didn't have a political agenda as such. There was no ideology there in Maxwell. I mean, he would use the papers, the Mirror in particular, to try and advance his business interests, which is why when he took over, there were bizarre headlines like "Burma, a country we know far too little about." Turned out that he had some plan to do business with Burma, and by and large they acquiesced.
I think it's worth pointing out, going back to your previous question, the nature of running a newspaper in the eyes of the public is all to do with what goes into the editorial. Who are you going to support in the current dispute about this, that, the other? To a newspaper, that's a trivial. That's a leader conference, or that's the editor himself, or something like that. I mean, most of the decisions that are issues between an editor, an editorial team, and the business and the proprietor are to do with the business of it. Do you have a book section? Do you circulate in Scotland? Do you have a separate edition? These decisions are decisions that do concern the proprietor, because they are about money. But the kind of irony of it all is that their decisions about running the newspaper as a product, running the newspaper as an intellectual entity, which is very much the editor's preserve, is to the public the paper.
Yes.
And so you've got these tremendous cross-cutting pressures within the newspaper as to who's sort of in charge of which bit of it.
Yeah, I took a bit more interest in the editorial than some of the others did, but not in a domineering way. But I think we have to make an exception also for Europe. It became such an issue that I think all the newspapers were preoccupied with how to treat it, including the publishers.
I was going to say on that, Conrad, what's the single thing you cared about most editorially?
At the Telegraph, you mean?
At the Telegraph. Yes,
Well,
just-
latterly Europe, certainly.
Yeah.
But we were enthusiastic supporters of the Thatcher government, and Mrs. Thatcher personally. And Max Hastings didn't get on with her, and our relations with Mrs. Thatcher, I must say, were complicated by Max's peculiar and inconvenient decision to fire Mrs. Thatcher's daughter as an employee, which led to one of the more difficult conversations I've had when she phoned me later that day, and the Prime Minister, I mean, and so I asked Max what he thought he was doing. So I'm sure this wouldn't have happened with you, Simon, but he explained to me what Carol Thatcher had done, which she shouldn't have done, and I agreed that what she did, she should. I mean, it wasn't that bad, but she shouldn't have done it. And I said, yeah, but Max, her mother is the Prime Minister with a parliamentary majority of 130, and if it wasn't for her, neither of us would be in our present positions, and I wouldn't be in this country. So you please think before you do stupid things like that.
I was surprised, actually.
Mrs. Thatcher came to Barbara's and my wedding party, and Max was there because he'd sort of done some arrangements for our little ceremony at Chelsea. And she said, "What's he doing here?" and I said, "Well, he's the editor, and he's a friend." And she said, "Is there a Mrs. Hastings?" And I said, "They're estranged." And she said, "I don't blame her."
She was one of the very few prime ministers who really didn't care about the press. She left Bernard Ingham, her press officer. His job was to keep newspapers out of her sight, and he insisted that she have an audience with editors every now and then. And I went to one of these audiences, and you'd sit down, she'd open up, say, "Oh, hello," and then talk for an hour. She was quite capable of talking for an hour without stopping. And at the end of it, Bernard Ingham, who's fallen asleep for about half that hour, and just snoring, I mean, she did oblivious. She then said, finally, I've done an awful lot of the talking. Tell me now, how is the Independent doing these days?
That brings us.
I have to say, our meetings were a little more convivial.
No, well, there, I'm sure.
That brings us
Good
to
reason,
this
I'm sure.
question: those who worry that power and influence is concentrated in the hands of the press barons, is it, and should we worry about that?
There was a moment in the I think it was the 70s, when the Daily Mirror was up for sale and was going to go to a ostensibly right-wing proprietor or company. I forget who it was. And the Guardian was about to fold. And the Herald had gone. Today programme was not left-wing. Every newspaper in Britain could, within a year, have been supporting the Conservatives. And the question then was, should government do anything about it? And it didn't happen, so the question wasn't alive. The press was still overwhelmingly right-wing. There's no argument about that. And it remains, I believe, an open question. In many countries, the press is very much of one persuasion. I have to say, I don't think it affects democracy very much. I mean, you think it would. I mean, I certainly think if all 10 British newspapers, the readers got up every morning and the paper said vote Conservative or vote Labour, there would be a demand for action. But it's never happened. Fortuitously, we've still got an amazing number of newspapers. They still present a range of views, much to our good fortune, but it is good fortune. So you just need always to be on your guard that things aren't going to get out of hand in one respect or another.
How important is it, this idea of the free press? I mean, we saw it sort of threatened or questioned under the Leveson inquiry. What was your sort of, I don't know if you followed it, Conrad, did you, Leveson?
That was really after my time.
Yeah.
I don't think that kind of thing does much damage, but I don't think it does too much good either. I just wanted to say this, the newspapers, of course, don't have remotely as much influence as they used to do. And I think there was always in this country, I mean, the phenomenon of this country, unlike other, like the United States or Canada or something, since there's only one time zone, the morning newspapers circulate throughout the country, and you don't have that in North America. So there is a great deal more power in an individual title than there normally would be in those countries. But I think it was always easy for politicians to run against the publishers. I mean, Stanley Baldwin referring to Rothermere and Beaverbrook as the harlot press and so on. The newspaper owners have to be careful being too overtly assertive in that way, I think, because there's a natural resentment of their abuse of their position if they do abuse it. Furthermore, I always thought that the idea of the publisher, the proprietor's power in society was exaggerated. I didn't feel that I had a great deal. I mean, I could reach the prime minister if I wanted to, but I didn't do it very often, and only when I had a good reason to do it. And occasionally, as Simon said, that she'd invite us all around and relays, and talk about things. I remember Rupert Murdoch and David Stevens and I went to lobby her not to put a sales tax on newspaper sales, and that led to some, I quoted Gladstone, and she said, "You haven't come here to quote that awful man to me, have you?" But I never had the impression we actually had that much power. I think Murdoch did, just because he had such a huge circulation. Yeah. I don't think anyone ever listened to Maxwell. And I would say one thing, though. In the 92 election, the last of those terms, John Major won, and he was the underdog, and Neil Kinnock was the Labour leader, was expected to win. And on election day, I believe the Sun's headline was "Don't throw it all away." And on page 3, they normally have an attractive young lady, scantily dressed or not dressed at all. And on this occasion, they had a 297-pound woman on a bicycle, and it said, if Labour wins for the next 4 years, the page 3 girl will look like this. But the Mail and the Express, the whole front page was very partisan. I think it was "Don't trust Labour," and we didn't do anything like that. But the reporting was fair, and the leader, of course, was a strong endorsement of the government. But I think those papers, 10 million circulation in total, did have an impact on
it tended to be the paper that the government of the day most feared, or the readership they most feared.
Yes.
Rupert Murdoch was hugely influential in the 80s and 90s because it was the Sun, and the Labour Party was always terrified of the Sun readership going conservative, and they were on the whole rock solid Labour. Under Blair, it was the Daily Mail. I mean, the Daily Mail, in an important sense, was running the government at times. I can remember decision after decision.
I think having worked there, it really was a daily running of the government sometimes. The paper would print the suggestion, and then the next day it would...
Alistair Campbell would telephone Jack Straw at the Home Office and order him to write an article for The Sun saying X. And he did it, including changing his mind when the government changed its mind a month later. It was about legalising marijuana.
Because I seem to remember when I talked to you about my Maxwell book, you described going to a lunch, I think at the Savoy Grill, and it was a sort of unofficial proprietors club, and Murdoch was there, and you were there, and Maxwell was there, and you would meet every so often. Is that right?
We. That was supposedly to welcome me to London, you see, and it was very convivial. I think it was in the Savoy, and Rupert couldn't stay long. David Stevens was there, but no, it was very nice. But we didn't meet as such like that at all afterwards. But there were occasional gatherings, more or less accidentally, with 2 or 3 of us, or 4 of us.
Conrad, can I just ask you, a personal question? So you had this sort of amazing, sort of life and this rise, but and you did spend some time in American jail, and you've been officially...
No, the jail's for the town drunk. It was a prison.
A prison? I'm so sorry. I just thought it was an American word. Okay, thank you. Did any of your experiences as a press baron prepare you in any special way for life? in prison.
No.
We'll help you.
Well, look,
Did
in
you
this
have
sense,
status in
I
prison?
was in a place that had, you could email, you see, not internet access, but my office could send me stuff from the internet, you see. And I was, as a gesture of solidarity, the late William F. Buckley invited me to become a columnist for the National Review after I had been spuriously convicted, as is now universally recognized, and or at least is acknowledged by the U.S. government anyway. So I was sitting there in this prison sending out these columns, and I had some in Canada too, so I had a great many readers. And so obviously my newspaper back then helped me in that regard. But no, apart from that, it was to take a line from Monty Python, something completely different. So a number of people in the room, including Andrew Roberts, were kind enough to visit me there. And it was, in the abstract, it was very interesting. It was an outrage I was there, of course, but it was actually quite interesting.
What was it? I feel like I interviewed you back in those days, and I remember you talking. You were sort of helping some prisoners with their education, weren't you? And you were sort of.
The Bureau of Prisons has a policy that anyone who hasn't matriculated from secondary school has to attempt to do so, and they have teachers for this purpose. And the teachers aren't very good, and the inmates assume it's just another ghastly trick by the evil regime, and don't. Approach it with the right spirit of a student trying to graduate. So when they didn't pass, they invented the post of tutor and invited me to fill that. And then I recruited a science tutor who was the former commander of the torpedo room of a nuclear submarine, and a mathematics tutor who was the head of the mathematics department in a large high school in Little Rock, Arkansas, and was a very talented commodities trader. He had IRS problems, that's why he was there. And so we were actually rather well qualified, and all of our lads passed, or over 200 of them in the time I was there, and they all graduated.
And didn't you get them to be your chefs in return?
No, that was another person who had been a chef.
Right.
He performed that, and we sent some money to his family.
Did your erstwhile colleagues as proprietors show any solidarity with you?
Did they do what?
Show any solidarity with you? Support?
That's a good question. Late on, Murdoch did. He was not helpful at all at the beginning, but our relations are quite cordial now. Not particularly close, but cordial. And Maxwell had died. Yeah, Jonathan Rothermere was pretty good, I have to say. And I didn't. Stevens was neither one nor the other, but they didn't seem to take much of a position.
One last question, I think, before we open up to the audience, which is sort of hanging over our debate, is this great sense of newsprint being behind us and the current political debate being in the hands of the social media in particular. Where do you see, I mean, we feel that this is, I think lots of people feel this is a particular example of power without responsibility, the hands, Zuckerberg, those new proprietors, really.
I agree with what you just said. It is a terrible abuse. It's a cartel of 4, approximately. And the Democrats were very vocal about how they were going to break it up, Senator Warren and Senator Sanders, the left of that party especially. But after the sandbag job they did on Trump, they changed their tune, and it's a straight political payoff that they're leaving them alone. And it's an outrage, and it's a menace to American democracy, but it will be dealt with either, well, I guess after the next presidential election, but it will be dealt. It can't go on like this. It is a dangerous concentration of improper, unfeasible authority and irresponsible men. I mean, they're not. These guys aren't, Rupert Murdoch or Lord Beaverbrook. I mean, they're a pretty strange group. And Zuckerberg's interventions directly in the elections. $400 million to produce these drop boxes, and stupefying numbers of harvested ballots being dropped in the middle of the night with huge majorities, impossible to verify the votes, and it is a menace, but it will be corrected.
Who do you think would have the stomach or the guts for correcting it?
Well, the Republican Party does, and they're, the tide's flowing towards them now.
What, Trump again?
I would think probably yes, but I think he'll. I mean, I don't want to put on the airs of intimacy with him, but he calls me occasionally, and while learning lessons that are disagreeable is not his strongest suit, I think he's taken on board that the presidency of the United States has to be conducted with greater dignity than he often did show.
Right.
Though he was, I want to say, I think he was
right?
a damn good president.
Right.
In policy terms, he was very good.
Right.
But you just can't behave like a jackass in that office. And he did too much of that.
Where I agree with Conrad is over your first remark. I mean, it cannot go on to have this extraordinary oligarchy of internet activity, particularly in a matter as important as free speech. And I think one of the most extraordinary things about the history of free speech over the past century has been it's been maintained by a private sector industry, the press, with minimal intervention from governments. And it is, I do believe, performed a very good job. The question is it now under genuine threat, which is the question you asked. Yeah. And I think it isn't. I really don't. I think the most extraordinary thing is that people crave editors. They crave an intermediary between the swamping of news that you get on social media and, all right, often what they want to believe about the world around them, but nonetheless a view of the world around them which is mediated by intelligent people. And I think the fact that if you just take the quality newspapers at the moment, although their circulation is quite small compared to what it used to be, their readership, i.e. online and in newspapers, is millions now. I mean, far more than ever before. So I mean, I always believe when we discuss the future of journalism, there's a great future in journalism, and it's called newspapers. They're needed. People crave them. They've got to find some way of mediating, moderating, and toning down social media, because it's a pest and a menace. Yeah. But the newspapers will live forever.
Wonderful.
Social media masquerades as a mere platform, a utility, like the telephone company doesn't intervene in what's said in the telephone calls. But in fact, they do intervene, and they tossed out an incumbent president of the U.S., banned him for life. Well, the Grand Ayatollah in Tehran has carried all these people. I mean, it's just outrageous.
I agree.
John, what do you?
Well, I think the great difference between now and then, then being, say, 30 years ago, is that the system basically existed out in the open, and everyone knew what the score was, and they were, to mangle the analogy, on stage with a curtain behind them. But now, everything is taking place behind the curtain, as it were, and I think that is extremely dangerous.
Okay. Thank you so much. And now I think we've got time for some questions, if anybody would like to ask something. So we've got two over here. Let's go to the gentleman.
If I may, I'd just like to embroider slightly on Conrad's anecdote about Roy Thompson and buying newspapers and making more money. In my version, the conversation took place between Roy Thompson and Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev, at the end of the exchange, said, "You know, Mr. Thompson, you can't take it with you." And Roy said, "Well, in that case, I'm not going." And to Simon's point about newspapers previously being party political organs, some century or so ago, in every major city in Canada there were two newspapers. There was one Liberal and one Conservative. And my great-grandfather was a member of the Canadian Parliament under Sir John A. Macdonald, and he was recruited to head up the Conservative Party of the province of Nova Scotia, which was in the doldrums. The Liberals dominated. So he had control of the Conservative newspaper, being the head of the party. So the election approached, and the headlines were, "It is time for change." The next day, "Change is at hand." The next day, he got roundly defeated in the election, lost his own seat, and the headline was, "Change is delayed."
Very good. The lady behind, and then we'll come to the front.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask, sort of particularly in the context of what you're talking about with sort of the newspaper industry being more under threat and bigger competition with social media and that sort of thing, and I guess also against the background of sort of fake news and everything that's been floating around with that. I was wondering what you thought, with regard, sort of from an editorial perspective, where the responsibility lay for newspapers to print what they think their audiences need to read, as opposed to what their audiences want to read. I'm a journalist myself. I work for an online newspaper, and I think particularly with sort of competition for clicks and that sort of thing, that's the sort of dichotomy that seems to exist. So I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Simon?
Well, I mean, newspapers have spent all that the whole time saying, what do our readers really want? Northcliffe's famous dictum, everything in a newspaper is propaganda except what someone somewhere doesn't want in print. There are all these maxims that go into it. My favourite is the Des Moines, Iowa Register, I think it was, with a line across the top of its headline says, "As independent as resources permit." It's a perfect slogan for any media organisation. No, it's a constant tussle. It really is. I mean, in a curious way, the only sort of indicator of what you and I would consider a balanced approach to the news is if you give 2 points of view. I mean, you just expect to see a quote from someone saying something and then a quote from the opposition saying the opposite. Often it's almost artificial. The BBC now will never broadcast a government statement without a crass line from the opposition after it. But it's the one defence you've got against biased news. And what worries me about social media, which I think is, in this respect, is an absolute menace, as Conrad said, it is not a platform. It's an editorial exercise. It is presenting what enough people smothering it with information put out, because the more people, the more they get money from advertising. And that's pernicious. And I'm assuming sooner or later, and Conrad said rely on the Republican Party. Well, we'll wait and see. But sooner or later, we will find a way of regulating this thing. But for the time being, it's chaos.
Victor, you had a question. All right.
So what would you, Simon, or Conrad, and John, what would you do to regulate the online?
Straightforward. I just end anonymity. I know there's a downside to it. I know the disadvantage of ending anonymity. I know anonymity is a great freedom in dictatorships and so on. But you've got to end anonymity. You cannot express a view in a properly edited newspaper without saying who you are. And that's how it should be.
Conrad, do you agree with that?
What did you? I didn't quite understand.
End anonymity. The idea that people can go on social media and nobody knows who they are.
Yes, I agree with that. And we always tried everywhere in all the newspapers we had to rigorously impose the distinction between reporting and comment. And I remember I had occasion to give a lift back from a luncheon we were at to Neil Kinnock when he was leader of the opposition. And he said, I want you to know that your parliamentary reporting is the first I read every day, because it's always very fair. I know you're opposed to me. I know, obviously the Telegraph is a conservative paper, but your parliamentary reporting is absolutely fair, and if I wasn't in the session the day before, that's what I read first. And I took that as a very high compliment, and that's what we tried to do. And we made the comment pages available to a wide number of reporters. If they wanted to write an opinion, they were free to do it and sign it as an opinion. But I think we've got to get back to that. I don't think it has decayed as much here as it has in the United States. But at the New York Times, the editor, the day after the 2016 election, triumphantly announced that it was not the duty of the New York Times to report. It was to advocate for what it believed would make a better America. Well, that is why, I assume the polls are kinder to the principal media outlets in this country. But in the United States, about 85% of people don't trust the media, and they're right not to trust it. It's not trustworthy. And that is a terribly dangerous thing in a democracy. We have to have a free press, but we have to have a free press that people have some confidence in, but they have to earn the confidence.
Sure. Another one? Sort of over here, and then we'll go.
Yes, Conrad, I know when you were being accused and going to trial and all the rest of it, you were concerned about how little support there seemed to be, or where that support was. I think there was much more support for you than you probably knew, because it's very hard to know what it was you were being accused of. And so support was very much the case invisible. Who you wrote to or who you did to try and support you was very, very hard. And I want you to know that there was much more support than you probably know. I once travelled on a bus with you for a very amusing conversation. I don't know where we were going, and I don't know where you came from. We were on a bus chatting quite merrily, and I, for one, would like to say I welcome you back.
Thank you so much. I will say, first of all, we all understand what it is when a prominent person or a prominent institution is beleaguered, and the spectacle of the descent of such a person or institution has a naturally somewhat amusing quality to it. So I understand why people find it sort of amusing to see people in a distressed condition. It's just like watching a building that's being detonated and you watch it come down. So in the abstract, I understood this was the backdrop of my travails, but I want to say I did get a great deal of support, confidentially, in emails and things, and I always had a lot of supporters. And my wife's book, which is on sale here, and which she commented on yesterday, she has it's called Friends and Enemies, and there's a list at the end of the friends and the enemies, and as she said yesterday, it isn't a vengeance book. There are 3 times as many friends as enemies, and they're 10 times as distinguished as the enemies. But there was a time when everything was coming down, and I was being defamed everywhere. That it was possible, if I didn't have a more kind of historic view of things, to think that I was, was my wife and me against the world, and with a handful of people supporting us. But thank you very much for your generous comment. I very much appreciate it.
This, sort of 4 rows back. This.
Thanks. I want to take a slightly different tack from that question. I want to ask panelists if they've seen Succession and how much that rings true. Particularly Simon, I'd be interested.
We watched a portion of one episode, which rang very true. Nothing is more onerous on a second and third generation of a great family than to be a second or third generation of a great family. If you take a dynasty like the Rothermeres or the Berries, maybe even the Murdochs, you do see sort of trouble brewing the further away you go from the original initiative. But that's the way it's been. I don't know. It's like hereditary monarchy. All the other systems are worse. It's worked in this country so far. I served on the Monopolies Commission for the Press, looking into every takeover bid that was in danger of taking any one company above 30% of the market. And a lot of Murdoch quite often was hovering on the brink of that. But I was always amazed that the system worked. Now, I'm not going to go on about it, but the fact is we've got 10 daily newspapers in this city, or this country. That is a huge privilege, and we should do everything we possibly can to maintain it.
John, Succession?
I have seen Succession. I very much enjoyed it. It doesn't actually have much in common with the Maxwell family, because essentially his children were all too frightened of him to challenge him.
Right. They've got their other issues.
They have their other issues, that's unquestionably
He attacked them physically, too.
Conrad, have you seen it?
I'm afraid I am a great disappointment. I'm not seen it at all. So
Okay.
I can't comment.
All right, another one. The lady in the stripy.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting conversation so far. My question is, do you see a difference between how newspapers are run traditionally by newspaper moguls and newspapers that are run by corporations, such as, not corporations, but the owners of corporations like Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post? And do you think the latter will become more of a trend in the future?
When I went from the Times to the Guardian, everybody said, isn't it nice to go from a paper that's run by a dictator to a paper that's run by a commune? No one from the Guardian here, I hope. The Guardian has got the most ferocious, nay tyrannical proprietorship of any newspaper in Britain. It's owned by a ghost. And it's the ghost of C.P. Scott. And he's 150 years old and he's still there today. I think one of the qualities of a paper, now I love The Guardian in all sorts of respects, is that it has a diverse staff. It's very important for the staff of a paper, as for the staff of the BBC, which is not often the case, to frankly be drawn from a wide political spectrum, because it keeps the debate going internally. And if it's not drawn from wide spectrum, then something else takes over, and something else is going to be a ghost.
Interesting. John?
I think a proprietor is a proprietor, and actually, I don't see any huge difference between a corporation and an individual. So no, it doesn't seem to me to be a particularly important distinction.
Okay. Conrad?
Your question, I think, is mainly where you have a proprietor of a newspaper focused on the newspaper as opposed to a chain, like the Thompson papers. They'd make a special case when they owned the Times or the Toronto Globe and Mail, but in general, they didn't. It's a chain, and whoever the publisher was could do what he wanted within reason. I think I agree with both my colleagues. I think goodness knows you're taking a gamble on a proprietor, and we have had newspaper proprietors who are really quite irresponsible. But in general, I think it's better that a newspaper get that degree of constant attention from from someone who cares about it than that it be a chain where, as long as people deliver adequate commercial results, no one pays much attention to the contents.
I've got a lot of sympathy with Conrad in one respect. If I'd spent 30 million or something on buying a newspaper and didn't give a damn what it said, I'd be out of my mind. I mean, I think, come on now, I've paid all this money. Why can't I be allowed to support Europe or the opposite?
Yeah, but Simon, this, is the argument of the so-called working press, that the ideal proprietor does not intervene at all. And it's an insane concept. It's like the head of an automobile company not ever driving the car or caring if it worked well, or the head of a soft drink company not caring if it tasted
well,
nice.
I mean, the owner of the car company at least should produce a decent car. He doesn't care where it takes you to.
No, but he is concerned with product quality, and the media, the working press, like proprietors who never intervene in any way in the editorial side of the newspaper. But the editorial side, as you said in your opening remarks, that's what the public sees.
Well, to that extent, the concept of editorial independence is novel. It's not traditional. It's novel. It's a new thing. It's very valuable. Mercifully, it still survives in various forms, but it's not natural to buying a newspaper, that's what I'm saying.
Well, I feel like this one could run and run, but unfortunately we have run out of time. But thank you so much to our wonderful panel. That was so interesting. And just to say that Simon and John will be going to the bookshop now to sign their books, and Barbara's wonderful book is also in there. So please head there, and then we'll all be sorted for Christmas. Thank you so much. Okay.